I've worked night shifts long enough to know when a story should fade with the morning light. Most of them do, but one memory, one voice, stayed with me in a way I can't explain. Even now, decades later, I still catch myself listening for it in quiet hallways, as if the echoes of those nights at the ward never fully let me go. It wasn't the kind of tale you expect to hear in a psychiatric hospital. We were used to confusion, tangled thoughts, fractured memories. But what he told me, it didn't sound like a wandering mind. It sounded deliberate, like someone trying to place a truth into the hands of the only person who might actually hold it for a moment. I didn't want to believe him at first. I told myself it was just another night, another story. But something in the way he spoke changed the way I heard everything afterward. The man was older, white hair falling past his collar, eyes dulled by medication, yet focused in a way I couldn't ignore. He carried a quiet urgency, the kind that doesn't rise or spill over, but settles somewhere deeper, like a weight you end up carrying long after the conversation ends. There were nights when he would sit perfectly still, watching shadows move across the floor as if tracking something I couldn't see. He told me he had come from another year, not as a warning or a performance, but as a confession, one he had repeated to so many people that even he no longer expected to be heard. Yet when he spoke to me, it felt different, not because I believed him, but because I couldn't dismiss the details as easily as I wanted to. The way he described the moment he fell out of his year unsettled me more than I admitted at the time. I didn't know then how deeply his words would settle into my life, or how often I'd replay them long after I left those halls. All I knew was that something in his story refused to fade, and even now I still question why I couldn't prove him wrong, why part of me still isn't sure I ever wanted to. The night shifts in the ward were quiet in a way that almost felt unnatural. The hum of the old radiators, the soft click of doors settling into place, the occasional shuffle of a patient turning in their bed, those were the sounds I had grown used to. Routine gave structure to the hours, and most nights passed without anything remarkable. But that winter in 1994 broke the pattern in a way I didn't understand at the time. Franklin Marsh had already been in our care long before I started working there. His chart was thick, his medication list long, and his expression carried the weary acceptance of someone who had run out of places to go. Patients like him didn't stand out, but the first time I spoke with him during my rounds, I noticed the way he studied the floor, as though tracing invisible lines that only he could follow. His long white hair fell forward as he leaned toward me, the movement slow and deliberate, and he asked if the date on the calendar was correct. I brushed it off at first. Strange questions were common, and I was used to answering them with simple reassurance. But he didn't seem confused. He seemed displaced. He watched the windows during storms, stared at the clocks during medication rounds, and paused before speaking, as if weighing every word. There was a gravity to him that I still remember, an intensity softened only by exhaustion. When he finally told me why he asked about the date, I felt something shift inside me. His voice was steady, the details too calm, too intact for someone claiming to have fallen out of his own year. I should have dismissed it. I should have reminded him where he was. But instead, I found myself listening, closer than I ever expected. Hi, my name is Peter. If you're enjoying this story, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. It helps a lot. Have you ever heard someone say something so strange that it stayed with you for years afterward? Thank you for being here and supporting these stories. Now let's get back to the story. The first time Franklin really spoke to me, it was just after 3 in the morning. Too late to call it night, too early to call it morning. The hour when even the building seemed unsure of itself. I was doing my round with a clipboard in hand, pretending the notes I wrote mattered more than the quiet weight of the place. Most of the men on that ward were asleep or sedated into something close enough. The lights were dim, the kind of pale yellow that made everything look older than it was. Franklin was awake. He sat on the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, long white hair hanging forward like a curtain, the hospital blanket gathered loosely around his waist. His eyes were on the small window in his room, even though all it showed at that hour was darkness and the faint reflection of the corridor light behind me. "You're off schedule," he said, without looking at me. I glanced at my watch, then at the notes on my clipboard. I was only a couple of minutes behind, maybe 3 at most. "Medication rounds ran a little late," I said. "I'm not that off." "I don't mean tonight," he replied. "I mean you. You shouldn't be here yet." There was no agitation in his voice, no edge, just a calm certainty that made the words land harder than anything shouted. I stepped a little closer to his doorway, letting the overhead light spill into the room. "What do you mean by that, Franklin?" I asked. "Can't sleep." He finally turned his head toward me, eyes adjusting to my outline in the door. For a moment he didn't answer. He just studied me, like he was deciding which version of the truth he was allowed to give. "Do you know what year it is?" he asked. I sighed quietly. It wasn't the first time a patient had lost track of time. We had calendars posted at the nurse's station and on the main bulletin board for that reason. "It's 1994, I said. "You've asked me that before." "Yes," he said. But I wasn't asking for me. I felt that small shift again, the same one I'd noticed when he'd questioned the calendar in the hallway. There was very little in his chart about active delusions. Most notes focused on his mood, his withdrawal, his resistance to certain medications. Nothing about a fixed belief or elaborate story. If he was making something up, he was doing it quietly. "Who are you asking for then?" I tried to keep my tone light, neutral, the way we're taught. Don't feed into it. Don't challenge too strongly. Just guide back to solid ground. "For you," he said. "You think this is the right year for you, don't you? You think you're where you're supposed to be." "That's a strange question," I said. "Most people don't put that much thought into it." "They should," he answered. "Some of us don't get the chance until it's already wrong." His fingers toyed absently with the edge of the blanket. His hands were rough, knuckles a little swollen, a faint scar crossing the back of his left hand. They were the hands of someone who had worked for most of his life, before whatever had brought him here. "Franklin," I said, "why do you keep asking about the year? Did something happen in 1994? He gave a soft, humorless sound that might have been the shadow of a laugh. "Something happened in a year," he said. "I'm just not sure yours is the one I should be in." I leaned against the door frame, feeling the cool paint through my sleeve. "Okay," I said slowly. "Where do you think you should be?" He looked past me toward the corridor clock at the end of the hall. It wasn't visible from his bed, only the faint glowing red of the digits reflected in the glass of his window. He watched that dim reflection as if tracking each second. "I used to know," he said. "You don't forget something like that, but it's like getting off a train at the wrong station. You recognize the platform, you recognize the tracks, but none of the faces look right. The names don't match what you remember. You feel like you got off at the wrong year," I said, half to clarify, half to see if he'd correct me. He nodded once. "I was supposed to arrive somewhere else, with someone else." He seemed so sure of it. I only came along to prove him wrong. He paused, jaw tightening just enough to show through the calm. "I've been here ever since." I wrote something meaningless on the form attached to my clipboard. Awake, maybe, or oriented to person and place. Because I needed the motion to cover the fact that I was listening more closely than I should have. "Who was he?" I asked. "The person you were supposed to be with?" His gaze shifted back to me. For the first time I saw something like caution in his eyes, as if the name itself carried a weight he wasn't sure I wanted. "That doesn't matter yet," Franklin said. "What matters is that you're early." "I've been working here for years," I said, trying to re-anchor the conversation in reality. "I'm not early for anything. Not for this place," he said quietly. "For what comes after it." The radiator hissed once behind me, a brief rush of heat breaking the stillness. Somewhere down the hall, someone turned over in their bed, the frame creaking. The building seemed to inhale and exhale around us. "You'll understand later," Franklin added. "Most people only start listening when it's already too late to change anything." I should have redirected him then, reminded him where he was, how we measure progress. Instead, I checked his vitals, adjusted his blanket, and told him to try to sleep. But as I walked away, I realized I hadn't answered his first question. For the rest of that shift, I couldn't stop thinking about it, about how casually he had asked if this was the right year for me, as if that were something a person could simply get wrong. I didn't expect Franklin's words to follow me out of his room, but they did. They stayed with me as I finished the rest of my rounds, as I signed off on the nightly reports, even as I took my break in the small staff room with its humming vending machine and coffee that tasted more like metal than anything brewed. The hospital had a way of pulling you into its rhythm, of making each night feel like a repeat of the one before. But that night felt different, even if I couldn't admit why. When I returned to the ward, the lights seemed dimmer, though no one had adjusted them. The air felt colder too, or maybe I was imagining it. Franklin had retreated under his blanket by then, lying on his side with his back to the door. He looked like any other patient trying to find rest in a place not meant for it. I almost convinced myself that our conversation had been nothing more than a tired mind reaching for something unusual to hold on to. But when I walked past his room again an hour later, I noticed something I hadn't before. He wasn't asleep. He was whispering to someone who wasn't there. I stepped quietly to the doorway. He lay perfectly still, eyes half open, his voice so soft I could barely catch the shape of it. The words weren't frantic or distressed. They were calm, measured, as if he were explaining something to an unseen listener. "Franklin," I whispered. He stopped. The stillness was immediate, too sharp. His breath steadied, and he slowly turned his head toward me. The look wasn't guilty or startled. It was resigned, like he knew I wouldn't understand anyway. "Just thinking out loud," he said. "That didn't sound like thinking," I replied. He didn't argue. Instead, he pushed himself upright, his long hair falling over his shoulders. The faint glow of the hallway light caught the strands, turning them silver. "Do you ever talk to someone who isn't there anymore?" he asked. The question hit harder than I expected. Everyone loses someone, but there was something in the way he said it, something that made it feel less like grief and more like distance. "That's not what I asked," I said gently. "Who were you talking to?" He hesitated, then looked toward the window again. "Someone who used to answer," he said. "Someone who used to stand exactly where you're standing." I stepped fully into the room, letting the door close behind me. "Franklin, there's no one else here. Just you and me." He nodded. "I know. That's the problem." His voice didn't tremble. His face didn't shift. He said it like a man giving a weather report. I took a seat in the plastic chair beside his bed. "Tell me who he was." "Not was," Franklin said. "Is. Somewhere. Or somewhen." He looked down at his hands. "He told me he could prove it." I didn't believe him. I laughed at him. He swallowed, the motion slow. I followed him only to make my point. I wasn't supposed to go far. I wasn't supposed to go alone. A faint sting crept into my chest, the kind that comes from hearing regret that's aged too long. "Did he promise something to you?" I asked. "No," Franklin murmured. "He warned me, and I didn't listen. I thought he was delusional. Turns out I was the one who didn't understand what I was stepping into." I felt the shift again, the same quiet, unsettling tug I'd felt earlier. It wasn't the content itself. It was the way he spoke, the clarity, the structure, the calm. None of it matched the profile of someone losing their grip on reality. "What was his name?" I asked. Franklin stared at the floor, his jaw working as though the name itself carried weight. "Luther," he finally said. "Luther Kane." The moment he said it, something in the room seemed to still. No sudden cold drafts, no flickering lights, nothing cinematic or dramatic. Just a pause, a tiny human pause, as if the building itself listened. "And no one's ever found him?" I asked. "No one's ever looked for him the right way," Franklin answered, "because no one believed he existed in the first place." His eyes lifted to mine then, dark, tired, steady. "That's why I kept asking you about the year," he said. "You think you're in the right one. You think your life lined up the way it was meant to. But some of us only find out we stepped off at the wrong moment after it already happened." I didn't have an answer, or maybe I didn't want to give one. Instead, I wrote another useless note in my chart, stood, and told him to get some rest. But as I left his room, I felt something new, a quiet awareness settling at the back of my mind. The unsettling idea that maybe, just maybe, Franklin Marsh wasn't asking the wrong questions. Maybe he was asking the right ones. Too early. I spent the rest of the shift pretending I wasn't thinking about the name he'd given me. Luther Kane. It repeated itself in my head with an odd rhythm, like a phrase I'd heard before but couldn't place. I checked the files during a quiet moment at the nurse's station. No mention of a Luther Kane anywhere in our records. No previous patient with that name. No emergency admission. Nothing in the transfer logs or intake notes. I shouldn't have looked. Curiosity isn't encouraged in our line of work. Curiosity means blurred boundaries, imagined patterns, narratives that don't belong to you. But I searched anyway, even though I told myself it was just part of due diligence. Franklin had spoken the name with too much certainty to ignore. Near the end of the shift, I walked past his room again. He wasn't whispering this time. He was sitting upright, knees drawn slightly upward, hands clasped loosely around them. His posture reminded me of someone waiting on a train platform, still, patient, staring at some fixed point ahead. "You're checking on me more than usual," he said without turning. I hesitated. Honesty came easier with him than it should have. "You said things I don't understand," I said. "I said things you weren't ready to understand," he replied. I stepped inside. "Is Luther Kane someone you met before you came here?" "Yes," he said, "but you won't find him in any record from this year." "That's not how people work," I said. "That's not how life works." Franklin finally turned his head. "You keep thinking of life as something that moves in one direction," he said. "That's your mistake. Everyone's mistake." He shifted slightly, wincing at a familiar ache in his shoulder. "Luther tried to explain it the night he left," he said. "He didn't tell me how it worked, just that I'd understand when I saw where he was from." His expression tightened, a brief flash of old frustration. "I followed him because I thought he was lying, because I thought I could embarrass him into admitting it." "What did he show you?" I asked. Franklin's jaw worked as if picking the right answer from several painful ones. "Nothing," he said finally, "because I never reached the same place he did. I stepped into something different, something I shouldn't have." "What do you mean?" He lowered his gaze, staring at the floor tiles. "Imagine two doors opening at the same time," he said. "You mean to follow someone through one of them, but you lose your footing and stumble through the other. They close behind you, and when you turn around, you find yourself somewhere familiar, but not meant for you." The air in his room felt heavier then, not supernatural, not strange, just weighted by the sincerity in his voice. "That's why I asked you about the year," Franklin said quietly. "Because you keep walking like everything lined up exactly as it should have, like nothing ever shifted under you. You should pay more attention to that feeling in your chest, the one you've been ignoring." I wanted to tell him he was wrong. I wanted to remind him he was in a psychiatric ward, medicated, monitored, evaluated. But the words wouldn't come. There were parts of my life that felt slightly misaligned, though I never voiced them. Little things that didn't bother anyone but me. Things I chalked up to nostalgia, stress, or the quiet ache that sometimes came from working too many nights in a row. But Franklin looked at me like he knew exactly how often I reran certain memories, how many times I'd paused in empty hallways because something felt off but couldn't be named. "You think I'm confused," he said, settling against the pillows. "You're young enough to believe confusion is a flaw. It isn't. Sometimes it's the only part of you that remembers something you've forgotten." I swallowed. "Franklin, if you think you came from another year, I don't think it," he said sharply but quietly. "I know it." He sighed, the exhaustion rolling through him like a slow tide. "But knowing isn't the hard part. The hard part is realizing no one else saw what you saw." He turned toward the window. "Or that the person who did is somewhere you can't reach anymore." The light from the hallway spilled across the floor in a thin, pale strip. Franklin watched it, not blinking, as if waiting for something that had already passed. "Go on," he murmured. "Finish your rounds. This part isn't for you yet." His voice wasn't dismissive. It was resigned. I left, but the words followed me down the hall. "Not for you yet." And for the first time that night, a quiet thought settled in my mind. What if he wasn't talking about his story? What if he was talking about mine? Morning rounds always felt different from the night, even if the fluorescent lights didn't change and the hallways were just as quiet. Daylight brought its own kind of order. Clipboards filled more quickly, voices were firmer, footsteps more purposeful. But after that night with Franklin, the routine felt thinner, almost fragile, as if it were trying too hard to hold itself together. I slept poorly after my shift. When I closed my eyes, I kept picturing him sitting in the dark, watching the window the same way someone watches a clock that's ticking toward a moment they fear. By the time I returned that evening, I still felt the echo of his words. "You're early for what comes after." I didn't know what he meant. I didn't want to know. But curiosity has a way of settling into the places doubt leaves behind. I checked in with the day staff before beginning my rounds. Nothing unusual in the reports. Franklin had eaten breakfast, refused group therapy, sat quietly during lunch, and spent the afternoon reading the same outdated magazine he'd been paging through all week. No incidents, no agitation, no mention of any unusual comments. You'd think he'd spent the day exactly as any long-term patient would, but he looked different when I stepped into his room that evening. He was sitting in a chair by the window instead of on his bed, posture straighter, hands folded in his lap. The sky outside was turning that washed-out blue that happens right before the cold settles in for the night. He didn't turn as I approached. I wasn't sure he even noticed I was there. "You're watching the sunset?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not the sunset, the line of it." I followed his gaze. There was nothing unusual, just the faint silhouette of the tree line and the last threads of daylight fading behind it. "What's different about the line?" I asked. He hesitated, then exhaled slowly. "It's not supposed to look like that." "How so?" "It's close, but not right." He tilted his head slightly, eyes fixed on the horizon. "When I first arrived here, the light hit differently. I've been trying to convince myself it's just the season, but it isn't." I pulled up the spare chair and sat beside him. "Franklin, you mentioned earlier that you stepped through the wrong door. If that's true, what did you expect to find?" He gave a small, sad smile. "I expected him to be there. Luther. I thought I'd follow him through and find him waiting on the other side, smug and pleased with himself. I was ready to joke about it, ready to prove him wrong." "You trusted him?" I asked. "No, that was the problem. I trusted myself to know better." He rubbed his thumb across his knuckles. He said he'd done it before, said he'd learned the pattern. I assumed the pattern was a fantasy. But then He paused again, the words getting quieter. Then I tripped. He said it like a confession, like an admission of a moment that changed everything. "Tripped?" I repeated. "Not physically," he murmured, "but that's the closest word I have." One second I was right beside him, listening to him talk about where we'd appear. The next, he snapped his fingers softly. Gone. He disappeared, and instead of standing where he stood, I stood somewhere else completely. Somewhere familiar but wrong. "You mean here?" I said. "Yes, here," he answered. But not here at the same time he meant. I felt my throat tighten. There was something deeply unsettling in the way he phrased it. Not dramatic, not frantic. Just a quiet, exhausted clarity. "Franklin," I said, choosing my words carefully, "are you saying you came from a different year because of this slip?" He nodded once. "And you'd be surprised how easy it is," he said. "One misstep, one moment of not paying attention, and your life stops matching the one you remember." He turned his head toward me then, the light catching his eyes in a way that made them look tired but not lost. "You think that sounds impossible," he said, "but you've felt it, haven't you? That strange emptiness when you look back at a memory and think it should feel different, or when someone mentions a moment you swear never happened." I didn't answer because I didn't want to admit how often that feeling visited me. Quietly, briefly, like a shadow passing behind a curtain. "You're early for what comes after," he repeated softly, "but not for long." His voice wasn't a warning. It was certainty. And for the first time, I didn't know whether I wanted to hear more. I tried to shake off the heaviness of his words as I continued my rounds, but something about them settled deeper than I expected. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like an uneasy recognition, as if he'd brushed against a part of me I'd spent years ignoring. The ward was quieter than usual that night, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing. The radiators hissed softly, a door clicked down the hall, and the building seemed to rest in a long, slow exhale. When I returned to Franklin's room later, I found him exactly where I'd left him, sitting in that same chair by the window, still watching the horizon, even though night had already smudged it into darkness. He hadn't turned on the lamp. His silhouette was just a shape in the dim. "You should try to sleep," I said gently. He didn't react at first. Then he spoke without lifting his head. "Do you hear it?" I listened. "Hear what?" "The repetition." I stepped inside. "What repetition, Franklin?" He finally turned toward me. His eyes weren't wild or frantic. They were calm, almost resigned. "Every night, we think we're moving forward, but we're just arriving at the same point with a different number written on it." I wasn't sure how to respond. "That sounds like you're talking about routine." "No," he said. "Routine is a cycle. This is a misalignment." The word hung in the air longer than it should have. "Franklin," I said, keeping my voice steady, "you talked about stepping through the wrong door. If that's true, if you believe you slipped into a different year, what kept you here instead of trying to go back?" His jaw tightened. "Because the only person who knew how to get back wasn't here with me. Luther." Yes. He rubbed his thumb against his wrist, as if tracing an old bruise. He said the moment would be obvious, that I'd know when it happened. But moments are slippery. They vanish the second you try to hold on to them. And you think he reached a different year than you? I know he did, Franklin said, because I saw the look on his face right before he left. He recognized it, the place he was going. He was relieved. I was surprised. Then he disappeared, and I didn't disappear with him. He looked down at his hands. I didn't realize how far apart 2 years can be. A long silence followed. Outside, the wind brushed against the glass, a low sigh through the trees. The building settled again, the pipes expanding and contracting with the cold. Franklin, I said slowly, I want to understand, but I need you to explain what you mean by misalignment. He leaned back, the chair creaking. It's when your life continues, but not the one you're meant to be living. When nothing is wrong enough to call it strange, but nothing is right enough to feel like home. The smallest details are off, familiar faces acting slightly different, moments you should remember but don't, choices you never made shaping things around you. My breath caught in my chest, because I knew that feeling. I'd never said it out loud, but I knew it. And you think that happened to me? I asked before I could stop myself. No, Franklin said. Not yet, but you're close. Close to what? He looked toward the window again, as if searching for something only he could see. Close to the part where you realize the difference between living in the right year and simply being stuck in one. I didn't know what to say. The room felt colder, though nothing in it had changed. You keep thinking I'm the one who's lost, Franklin murmured. But maybe I'm just the one who noticed first. A sudden noise echoed down the hall, a metal cart shifting, nothing unusual, but both of us turned toward it. Franklin's eyes narrowed. Do you ever feel like something is about to happen? He said quietly. But you don't know if it's meant for you? I swallowed. Sometimes. That's the first sign, he whispered. I didn't ask of what. I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. But as I left his room, I realized something unsettling. For the first time since he'd begun speaking, I wasn't dismissing his words as delusion. I was trying to understand them. I tried to refocus on the shift, to anchor myself in the familiar tasks, the medication checks, the chart updates, the soft conversations with patients who wandered at night. But the ward felt different, as if something in its foundation had shifted. Even the shadows seemed longer. Not darker, not ominous, just stretched thin, like the building itself was tired. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself Franklin's words had gotten under my skin. But then small things began catching my attention. A clock at the nurse's station that usually ticked faintly sounded quieter than normal. A calendar page that I was sure had been straight earlier now hung slightly crooked. The bulletin board by the stairwell had a new notice pinned to it, though no one had mentioned any updates during briefing. None of these were strange enough to comment on, but together, they made the night feel off balance. It wasn't until I checked on Franklin again that the feeling sharpened. He hadn't moved from his chair, but he looked alert, more present than before. His posture was straighter. The lines in his face seemed deeper, carved by years that didn't belong to this place. When I stepped into the room, he didn't turn right away. It was as if he already knew I was there. You feel it now, he said softly. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Something in my silence told him enough. It always starts small, he continued. A sense that something's leaning the wrong way. A detail that doesn't match the memory you carry. People think they're just tired, distracted, forgetful. But those moments aren't accidents. They're reminders. Reminders of what? I asked. That you're not as far from the edge as you think. The phrase settled in the room like dust. I moved closer, keeping my voice measured. Franklin, what edge are you talking about? The place where things don't match, he said. The point where two versions of your life split, and you realize the one you're living isn't the one you were meant for. He turned his head toward me, eyes sharp. Luther used to call it the drift. What does drifting mean? I asked. It means you're walking through a year that isn't yours, he said. Not completely. Most people drift a little. A wrong memory here, a wrong face there. But some of us drift too far. He paused, then added, and when that happens, we fall through. I felt a coldness settle in my chest, though nothing about the room had changed. Franklin, you said you didn't mean to follow Luther, that you only wanted to prove him wrong, that you weren't supposed to go far. What did he promise you before it happened? He didn't promise anything, Franklin said. He warned me, told me not to stand too close when he tried it again, told me the pattern wasn't stable. I thought he was trying to scare me off, but I wanted to see the moment he realized he was wrong. A shadow crossed his face. Turns out I didn't see that moment at all. His fingers tightened slightly around the arm of the chair. I saw him disappear. I saw him leave me behind in a place that wasn't mine. You're saying he jumped to a different year, I said. I'm saying he reached the year he meant to. Franklin's voice dropped. And I didn't. I leaned back, feeling the frame of the chair beneath my palm. And you've been waiting for him? I've been waiting for the moment, Franklin corrected. What he described wasn't a door, or a tunnel, or a path. It was a moment. A thin place in time where things line up. He told me I'd see it eventually, even without him. His gaze lifted to mine. I just never expected to see it in you. The air left my lungs in a slow, unsteady breath. What do you mean by that? You asked me earlier why I kept watching the horizon, he said. Why I stare at the clocks. Why I listen for the repetition. His voice softened. It's because I'm waiting to feel the moment again. And tonight, it felt close. He shifted slightly, as if listening for something inside the walls. Close to you, he said quietly. The words struck something deep in me, something I couldn't immediately name. A thought, a memory, a sense of misplacement I'd carried for years without acknowledging. So tell me, Franklin murmured, barely audible. When you walked in tonight, did this place feel exactly like you remembered it? I didn't answer, because the truth, the quiet, unsettling truth, was that it hadn't, and the realization hit me with a weight I wasn't prepared for. I tried to anchor myself in familiar tasks, but everything felt just a shade off. Not wrong, not frightening, just shifted, like a photograph that had been reprinted with slightly altered tones. The ward felt too quiet, the hallways oddly long, the sounds slightly muted. I told myself it was exhaustion. Long shifts could twist perception, make shadows feel heavier, or corners seem further away. But the unease didn't fade. If anything, it settled in deeper. When I returned to Franklin's room, I found him standing for the first time that shift. His posture was stiff, hands steady on the windowsill, his long white hair falling down his back like a thread of silver. He wasn't looking outside. He wasn't looking at anything. His head was angled upward, listening. For what? I asked before I could stop myself. He didn't turn. Patterns. The word came out almost as a sigh. What patterns? The same ones Luther talked about. The ones you don't notice until they're too close to ignore. I stepped closer. Franklin, what are you hearing? He finally turned toward me. You don't hear it yet. That's good. You're not drifting as far as I thought. He hesitated. But you are drifting. I opened my mouth to argue, to ground us back in reality, but the words didn't come. Something in his tone stopped me. Something like regret. What makes you think that? I asked softly. When you walked in tonight, you looked around the room twice. His voice remained even. You do that when something feels different. You think no one notices, but I do. I said nothing. He wasn't wrong. When I'd first stepped in, I had looked at the room longer than usual, as if trying to confirm everything was where I remembered it. You asked me earlier, Franklin said, what it meant to slip. He stepped away from the window with slow, deliberate movement, like someone unfamiliar with the ground beneath them. It means the moment you realize your memory of a place doesn't match the place itself. That could be anything, I said quietly. Stress, fatigue, even nostalgia. No, he replied. Fatigue makes you forget. Nostalgia makes things feel softer. But drift makes the familiar feel foreign. You don't forget. You just don't recognize. He walked past me and lowered himself carefully onto the chair beside his bed. When I first noticed it, I was standing in a house I'd lived in for 20 years, he said. But the scent of the wood was wrong. The way the light filled the hallway, wrong. The sound of the kettle, the angle of the shadows. He shook his head. Nothing dramatic, nothing impossible, just wrong. And that's when you followed Luther? I asked. No, that was before, long before. His gaze lifted. That was when I thought the problem was me. I took a seat across from him, the room falling quiet around us. What happened the night you followed him? I asked. Franklin took his time answering. The silence stretched so long that I thought he wasn't going to respond at all. He asked me to meet him behind the shop where he worked. Said he'd found it. A moment, not a doorway, not a machine. A moment. Franklin's hands tightened slightly on the armrests. He told me I'd feel it before I saw it. Like gravity shifting. A pull. A pull toward what? Toward alignment, he said. Toward the year that matched the life you were supposed to live. He exhaled slowly. I didn't believe him. I went to prove him wrong. But the moment we stepped toward it, he moved one way and I moved another. I felt something slip under me. A tilt, just for a heartbeat. And then he was gone. And you were here, I said. No, Franklin whispered. I was somewhere that looked like here. A place close enough to confuse me. Close enough to fool everyone else. But not close enough to be the one I came from. His voice softened. And now you're hearing it too. The small things. The slight differences. That's where it begins. I felt my chest tighten. I'm not drifting. Franklin watched me with quiet sympathy. That's what I said too. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a long moment, until I realized the life I was living wasn't the one I remembered. Outside the room, the hallway lights flickered, not dramatically, not unnaturally, just a single soft dimming as if the power strained for a moment. Franklin opened his eyes. There, he said quietly. The pattern moves. The flicker lasted less than a second, just a soft dip in the lights, barely enough to notice if you weren't already searching for meaning in every small thing. But Franklin saw it, or maybe he'd been waiting for it. His eyes stayed fixed on the hallway even after the light steadied, as if something invisible had passed through and left an imprint only he could sense. It's close tonight, he murmured. I stepped to the doorway, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the hallway was empty, perfectly still. The nurse's station lamp glowed the same dull yellow, and the clock above it blinked its steady digital pulse. Nothing looked unusual, and yet I felt something. A subtle pressure behind the ribs. A kind of internal leaning, like the world around me was tilted by a fraction of a degree. You're imagining it, I told myself, but the certainty wasn't there. Franklin leaned forward in his chair, his voice low. Luther said the moment wouldn't announce itself. It wouldn't glow or shake the room. It would pass like a breath, quiet, barely there, easy to miss unless you were already drifting. Franklin, I said softly, if you believe this moment is coming back, what do you think it wants? He gave a soft, humorless smile. It doesn't want anything. It's not alive. It's not trying to send a message. It's just alignment. Two edges brushing close enough to feel. He tapped the side of his head. The problem is what we do when we recognize it. I crossed my arms, partly to steady myself. What did you do? I followed it, he said. I stepped toward it when I should have stayed where I was. I thought I could force understanding into something that wasn't meant for me. His gaze settled on me with unsettling precision. Don't make the same mistake. I opened my mouth to respond, but a noise down the hall interrupted. Someone clearing their throat maybe, or a chair shifting. A completely normal sound, but it made both of us look up sharply. Who's on the floor with us tonight? Franklin asked, almost casually. Just me and Karen until midnight, I said. Why? He stared past me again. Because someone else just walked by. I stepped into the hall. Again, nothing. No movement, no shadow turning the corner. Just the soft hum of the vents pushing warm air through the ducts. You didn't hear footsteps, I said firmly. Franklin thought about it. No, he said. I felt them. I turned back to him, unsure whether to challenge him or myself. Franklin, do you think you're slipping again? His expression softened. No, this isn't my moment. I learned that a long time ago. He paused, but I can tell when someone else is close to theirs. I'm not, I insisted. You were never supposed to be here on nights, he said quietly. The sentence cut deeper than I expected. What does that mean? It means the version of you I remember. He exhaled slowly. He didn't work nights. Something shifted, maybe something small, but it changed your path just enough to bring you into a place where you weren't meant to be. A chill ran through me. Not fear, but recognition. I had taken night shifts only after a mix-up in scheduling months earlier. I'd agreed to cover a few, then a few more, until it became routine. I'd never thought twice about it. That's just coincidence, I said. Is it? Franklin asked. Or is it drift? His voice wasn't accusing. It was tired, worn, as if he'd had this same conversation 100 times with 100 people who never understood. He closed his eyes again. Luther always said the same thing. The moment finds people who aren't looking for it. And you think it's finding me? Franklin didn't answer directly. I think you're starting to notice. He nodded toward the hallway. You're seeing the edges. That's where it begins. I stood in silence, unsure of what to say. The radiator clicked behind us, settling with the temperature change. A normal sound, ordinary, predictable. But to my ears, it felt strangely sharp, like a reminder that the room was holding its breath along with us. You should go finish your rounds, Franklin said softly. Things feel closer when you stand still too long. I stepped out into the hall again. Everything looked normal, but normal no longer meant what it used to. And for the first time, I didn't know whether I was walking away from something or toward it. I moved through the ward, trying to collect myself, but the quiet only made the tension more pronounced. Each door I passed felt like a checkpoint, each patient like a witness to something I wasn't sure I understood yet. The smell of disinfectant, the hum of the vents, the distant clatter of a cart, everything familiar, everything routine. Yet everything carried the faint suggestion of being slightly off, as if I were walking through a memory of this place rather than the place itself. At the end of the hallway, I paused near the large window that overlooked the trees behind the hospital. The sky was deep blue, the kind that settles over New Hampshire in winter. Heavy, almost physical. A thin layer of frost had begun creeping along the corners of the glass. Nothing strange about that. But the frost seemed to spread in a pattern, branching in lines that reminded me of cracks rather than ice. I inhaled slowly, then stepped back. Maybe I was imagining it. When I returned to Franklin's room later, he was back on the bed, sitting cross-legged, hands resting loosely on his knees. His long white hair fell forward in soft strands, illuminated by the dim hallway light. He looked calmer than before, calm in a way that suggested the storm was already passing through him. You felt it again, didn't you? He asked, without looking up. I didn't answer right away. Something changed, I finally admitted, but I can't explain it. That's how it starts, he said, not with clarity, with the sense that clarity is coming. I sat in the chair beside him. You said you knew when Luther reached his moment. How? Franklin shifted slightly, his voice low. Because he stopped looking confused. People who drift, they carry confusion like a shadow. When he stepped into the moment, that confusion disappeared. He looked like he finally recognized where he was supposed to be. And you? I asked. I looked like someone who didn't recognize anything anymore. His voice tightened, a quiet ache woven into it. I kept thinking I'd catch up, that if I waited long enough, the moment would return. But it never aligned for me again. Why not? I asked quietly. He looked up at me then, really looked. Because I wasn't meant to follow him, he said. I wasn't meant to be there. I forced myself into a moment that wasn't meant for me, and I ended up somewhere I didn't belong. He paused, searching my face. That's why I don't want you making the same mistake. I'm not following anyone, I said. Maybe not, he whispered. But moments don't care about intention. They care about alignment. A noise echoed down the hall, a soft metallic clink, like someone nudging a cart or adjusting equipment. I stood, instinctively checking the hall. Empty, silent, normal, and yet the sound lingered in my mind as if it carried a shape or direction. Do you really think something's coming for me? I asked, returning to him. Franklin shook his head. Not coming for you. That makes it sound personal. It's not. It's simply moving, passing through. And you're close enough to feel the shift. He paused. I didn't expect that. Why not? Because the first time I met you, years ago, you felt grounded, solid. People who drift tend to carry a particular look, but you didn't. You looked like someone firmly in their year. He tilted his head. Tonight, you don't. A chill ran across my spine. Franklin, I said softly, I need you to tell me what I should do. He let out a long breath, thoughtful and slow. You should pay attention, he said. More than that, you should be honest with yourself. Think about the moments you've questioned. The times you felt like you stepped slightly to the wrong side of something. We all feel it at least once, but some people, he gestured vaguely toward the air. Some people feel it more often. And that's where it starts. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees. And if it is starting, what then? Franklin looked toward the door. His eyes softened with something like sorrow. Then you'll understand me better than anyone here ever has. His voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It was steady, quiet, almost gentle. And understanding, he added, comes right before the moment chooses someone. I sat there in the dim silence, trying to steady my breathing, aware of the faint hum of the lights, the soft creak of the building settling, the slow pulse of something unseen pressing close. And for the first time, I couldn't tell whether I was comforting a patient or sitting beside the only person who truly knew what was happening to me. I tried to keep myself occupied with the small certainties of the ward, the medication cart, the logbook, the steady pattern of room checks, but my focus slipped every few minutes. The hallway felt longer now, almost stretched, as if each step echoed a fraction of a second later than it should have. The lights overhead hummed with their usual low vibration, yet somewhere underneath that sound lived a subtle tremor I couldn't quite place. Maybe Franklin had planted the idea in me. Maybe I was letting suggestion shape my senses. But the building felt different. Not wrong, just unfamiliar in its own familiar way. When I reached the back supply closet, I paused. The door wasn't fully shut. A faint draft leaked through the gap, brushing against my sleeve. I always closed that door. The latch tended to stick, and everyone on shift knew to pull it firmly until it clicked. I reached for the handle and hesitated. The air coming through the opening felt colder than the hallway. I opened the door slowly. The closet looked exactly as it always had. Shelves stacked with linens, boxes of gloves, cleaning supplies. But the cold was real. A steady chill clung to the floor, rising in thin wisps of breath I could barely see. Old vents, I muttered to myself. Drafts, nothing more. But when I backed into the hallway again, the warmth returned instantly, the contrast sharp enough to make me pause. I shut the door firmly, listening for the latch to catch. For a moment it didn't, and then, with a slow metallic click, it settled. I took a breath and went to check on Franklin. His room was dim, the hallway light cutting a narrow line across the floor. This time he wasn't sitting or standing, he was pacing. Slow, steady steps from one side of the room to the other, like he was measuring the space. "Franklin," I said quietly. He stopped mid-step, shoulders rising with a hitch of breath. Then he turned. "I didn't hear you coming," he said. "You usually do," I replied. "That's why I didn't," he murmured. "The moment hides itself when it gets close." I stepped farther inside. "You keep talking about this moment as if it's something predictable, but you said you've only felt it once." "One time is enough," he said. "It teaches you the pattern, and you think it's happening again." "Not for me," he said softly. "I told you that. I'm not going anywhere. I missed my alignment a long time ago." His gaze found mine, steady and unsettling. "But something is shifting near you." "I don't believe that," I said. "You don't have to," he answered. "Belief has nothing to do with it." He moved back to the window, fingers resting on the sill. The glass fogged under his breath. Outside, the trees swayed lazily in the wind, branches brushing together with a rhythmic tremor. The sky had deepened into a near black, the kind that makes reflections sharper than the world beyond. "I heard something earlier," Franklin said. "A vibration. Small. Like the building bracing." "The heating system does that," I said automatically. "No," he whispered. "This came from outside the year." I opened my mouth to argue, but something in my throat tightened. The phrase wasn't frightening. It wasn't dramatic. It carried a quiet certainty that made it feel possible. He continued. "Luther said the moment always arrives with a subtle shift, a slant in the air, a pressure, sometimes a sound you can't quite place." He paused. "Have you felt it yet?" I thought of the supply closet, the cold, the latch resisting, the way the air had seemed to thicken for a breath. I thought of the strange flicker in the hallway earlier, the way the building had felt like it was leaning, ever so slightly, toward something unseen. "I don't know what I felt," I said honestly. Franklin nodded. "That's how it begins. Confusion that feels like recognition." I sat down in the chair by his bed. "Franklin, what exactly happened to you the moment you slipped? What did it feel like?" He took a long breath. "Like a memory forming in reverse," he said. "Like realizing something was familiar only after it changed." And then, his voice thinned. A pull, a pressure behind the ribs. Not forward or backward, just inward. I felt that description settle in my chest like a stone. "And when it ended?" I asked. When it ended, Franklin whispered, the world looked almost the same. Almost. Enough to fool everyone but me. The hallway lights buzzed softly, the familiar background hum shifting by the smallest fraction of tone, barely noticeable, easily dismissed. Except I noticed. Franklin's eyes lifted. There it is again, he said. And for the first time, I wasn't sure whether he was imagining it or whether I was finally hearing what he had been hearing all along. The sound faded as quickly as it came. So faint I might have missed it if I hadn't been listening for anything even slightly unusual. It wasn't a hum or a buzz. It was more like a shift in pressure, a soft tightening in the air, the way a room feels before a storm breaks. Yet outside, the wind had calmed, the branches barely moving against the dark sky. Franklin stayed still, eyes fixed on the doorway as if he expected someone to appear. His breathing slowed, each inhale careful, measured. You hear it now, he said. I heard something, I admitted, but that doesn't mean. It means exactly what it means, he murmured. The alignment is getting closer. I wanted to dismiss it. I wanted to name it something ordinary, a settling pipe, an old fuse, the drafty bones of a building older than me. But the way Franklin watched me, steady and knowing, made the explanation feel like a flimsy excuse. He stepped away from the window and sat on the edge of his bed. When Luther found his moment, he told me the pattern showed itself slowly. First in the room, then in the air, then in the person. What does that mean? I asked. It means you'll feel it before anything changes around you, he said. A tightening, a weight, the sense that something is leaning toward you. I swallowed. And you think that's happening now? Franklin studied me for a long moment. I think you're noticing the edges, he said. And once you start noticing, you don't go back to how things were before. He leaned forward slightly. Tell me the truth. When you walked the ward tonight, did anything feel unfamiliar to you? Too many moments came to mind. The frost pattern spreading like cracks, the strange quiet, the supply closet coldness, the flicker in the lights, the brief echo of footsteps that never came. I didn't want to admit any of it. Maybe, I said. Franklin's expression softened, not triumphant, not satisfied, just sad. That's how it starts, he whispered. A far-off clang echoed through the building, the sound of a metal gate or a rolling cart hitting the stopper at the end of a hallway. Normal, routine, except tonight it sounded delayed, like the sound reached me a fraction of a second after it should have. Franklin glanced toward the hall again. You remember what I told you? He asked. About drift? You said it happens when your life doesn't match the one you remember. Yes, but drift has levels. He held up 2 fingers. Most people drift just enough to feel a passing emptiness, a sense of something missing, a moment where the world feels like it skipped a beat. He lowered 1 finger. But deeper drift, he paused, lowering his voice. Deeper drift feels like the world is slightly misaligned, as if you've stepped into a place where everything is familiar, but made from different pieces. A faint shiver ran through me. Not fear, but recognition. A quiet acknowledgement of something I had never put into words. And when it deepens even further, he said, lowering his other hand, you start hearing the pull. My breath caught. Pull? Yes. What does it sound like? Franklin thought for a moment. Like silence leaning toward you. The description made no rational sense, and yet I understood exactly what he meant. The moments tonight had felt like that. Silence with intent, silence with direction. I stood from the chair, needing movement. Franklin watched me with the stillness of someone who had lived through this before. You're scared, he said, not unkindly. No, I replied automatically. Then you're lying to yourself. I didn't argue. He folded his hands in his lap. You think this is happening because of me? He said. But it isn't. I didn't cause your drift. I only see it. Why me? I asked. Why now? Because something shifted, Franklin said simply. In your life, in your choices, in the path you're on. Maybe it was small, maybe it happened years ago, but drift doesn't care about scale. It cares about recognition. What am I supposed to do? Nothing, he said. Moments don't arrive because you chase them. They arrive because they brush against your life, even if you never ask them to. He looked toward the window again. And tonight, something brushed close. The building creaked softly, an old timber expanding with the temperature change. But the sound traveled strangely, like it moved in a curve instead of a straight line. Franklin's shoulders stiffened. "There," he whispered. "You felt that. Don't pretend you didn't." I didn't pretend, because pretending suddenly felt impossible. And for the first time, I wondered if the moment Franklin spoke of wasn't approaching. Maybe it was already here, quiet, subtle, and waiting. I told myself I needed air. Not outside, just distance. Enough space to reorder my thoughts. Enough time to convince myself that everything I felt tonight had an ordinary explanation. But when I stepped into the hallway, the air didn't feel like relief. It felt thicker, as if the building had subtly shifted its weight while I wasn't looking. The corridor stretched out before me, long and silent, the lights humming faintly above. I walked slowly, eyes tracing the familiar anchor points I'd relied on for years. The bulletin board, the double doors, the framed evacuation map with its faded corners. But even these markers felt slightly displaced, as if they'd been moved half an inch to the left or right. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't supernatural. It was just wrong enough for the mind to hesitate. I paused near the nurse's station. The clock on the wall blinked 10:14 p.m. The numbers looked normal, but I realized something strange. The second mark on the digital display seemed to hover for a fraction longer than usual, as though the clock was thinking about turning over before actually doing it. That wasn't possible, but I stared at it anyway. And the longer I looked, the more the seconds seemed to move with a faint lag. I stepped back, hard. "You're noticing," came Franklin's voice behind me. I spun around. He was standing in his doorway, something he rarely did. His tall frame leaned lightly against the frame, long white hair brushing his shoulders, eyes fixed on me with a tired understanding. "You shouldn't be out of your room," I said, though the words felt hollow. "I needed to confirm something," he replied. "Confirm what?" "That you saw it," he said simply. "The delay." My chest tightened. "Franklin, clocks glitch. It happens." "Not mechanically," he murmured. "Temporally." He stepped into the hall, slow and careful. Luther described that too. He said the first tactile sign is hesitation in the world, as if time itself is thinking, as if it's waiting for alignment. "This isn't alignment," I insisted. "This is stress, fatigue, and you're influencing me. You've been in my head all night." Franklin nodded, but not in agreement, in sympathy. That's what I told myself too, right up until the moment. I forced myself to take a step back. "Franklin, I don't want to hear about your moment anymore." "That's good," he said. "It means yours hasn't decided yet." "I don't have a moment." He looked past me toward the end of the hall. "Everyone has one. Most people never reach it." A soft metallic thump echoed from the far end of the corridor. A supply cart bumping into a wall, maybe, or one of the old doors settling in its frame. Ordinary, but the sound felt curved, like it traveled toward us at an angle rather than straight through the air. Franklin inhaled sharply. "There." I clenched my jaw. "That was just the building." "No," he whispered, eyes narrowing. "That was drift touching the structure." I felt a prickling at the back of my neck. "Stop." He turned his gaze back to me. "If you keep denying it, you'll lose track of which moments belong to you." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Did you always work nights?" The question hit harder than I expected. "No," I said, "but schedules change. How often do you feel like you arrived somewhere a moment too soon?" Franklin continued. "Or a moment too late?" "That's everyone," I said, voice tight. "Not like this," he replied. "Not with the building responding to you." I opened my mouth to argue, but another soft sound drifted through the corridor. Not footsteps, not machinery. More like a faint shift in pressure. A tone so low it seemed to come from inside the walls rather than beyond them. The fluorescent lights dimmed by a degree, barely noticeable, and then returned to normal. My heartbeat stuttered. Franklin watched my face. "There. You felt it." I swallowed hard. "You're reading into things." "I'm reading you," he said. "And you're changing." I shook my head. "I'm not." "You are," he said gently. "And it's not your fault. Sometimes drift chooses people who never asked for it." Silence filled the hallway. Thick, heavy. Franklin stepped closer, his expression weary but resolute. "The moment isn't here yet," he said softly, "but it's circling you." I felt my stomach drop. "Why me?" "Because something in your life shifted," he whispered. "Maybe years ago, maybe last week, but enough to nudge you off your original path. He glanced at the clock. It blinked, a normal blink, a digital skip. But to both of us, it felt like a breath held too long before letting go. And in that breath, I realized something that chilled me deeper than the cold air in the supply closet. Franklin wasn't trying to pull me into his world. He was trying to warn me about my own. I tried to pull myself away from the moment, whatever the moment meant to Franklin. I returned to the nurse's station, forcing myself to breathe normally, to focus on the logs, the charts, the comfort of numbers and handwriting. But every time I blinked, the hallway felt a fraction different. A subtle shift in the shadows, a faint change in the hum of the lights, a delay in the sound of my own footsteps reaching my ears. I rubbed my temples, trying to steady myself. Get a grip, I told myself. You're letting a patient get under your skin. You're tired. You're imagining patterns because you spent too long listening to him. But then the room temperature dipped again, barely noticeable, a soft chill brushing along my arms. The radiators were still humming, steady as ever. No draft, no vent malfunction. Still, the air felt colder in a way that wasn't physical, more like the memory of cold, the kind of chill that comes before something familiar changes. I stepped out from the nurse's station to reset myself with a quick walk. Maybe movement would help. Maybe routine would pull my senses back where they belonged. But as I walked, my steps fell into an unintended rhythm. 3 soft taps, then a slight echo, then 3 more taps, then another echo, just a fraction out of sync. It took a moment before I realized the echo didn't match the timing of my stride. I froze. The hallway was empty, but the echo continued. 1 final tap, delayed, like a step taken a moment too late, a step that wasn't mine. I forced myself to look back. Nothing, only the quiet corridor, familiar yet somehow altered, as if each object had been subtly rearranged when I wasn't looking. I tried to shake it off, tried to explain it. The building was old. Sounds traveled strangely. That's all. But the doubt had lodged itself deep. I turned to return to the nurse's station and nearly collided with Franklin. He stood inches from me, breathing steady, expression unreadable. "You felt it," he said quietly. Not a question, a fact. I stepped back, pulse racing. "Franklin, go back to your room." He didn't move. "Tell me what you felt." "You shouldn't be out here," I snapped, the edge of fear sharpening my voice more than I intended. Franklin didn't react to the tone. He rarely did. He simply studied me in that calm, unsettling way that made me feel like he was looking through me rather than at me. "It's happening faster than I expected," he murmured. "What is?" I demanded. "The overlap." He walked past me, slow and deliberate, as if stepping across a line only he could see. He looked down the corridor, eyes narrowing slightly, as though searching for something hidden between the plaster and the air. "When I slipped," he said, "the world felt like this. Not broken, not impossible, just misaligned, as if I were walking through a version of a familiar place that didn't fully belong to me." "You're projecting your experience onto me," I insisted, "and I'm exhausted, that's all." Franklin turned toward me with a heaviness in his gaze. "Exhaustion doesn't make time hesitate." I felt that in my spine. "You said Luther told you what the moment feels like," I said, trying to steady my voice. "What else did he tell you?" Franklin exhaled, a long, slow release of breath. "He said the moment doesn't care who notices it. It doesn't choose people because they're special. It doesn't need belief. It just aligns. And when it brushes against you, you don't forget the sensation, even if you try." He paused. "Did you?" I didn't answer. Couldn't, because the echo of that delayed footstep was still ringing faintly in my bones. Franklin moved closer, lowering his voice. "You think you're grounded in this year, but something in you shifted. Maybe it was small. Maybe it was years ago. But the moment is testing you now, seeing if you're aware, seeing if you'll notice the edges." "I don't want to notice anything," I said. "Neither did I," Franklin whispered, "and that's how I got stuck here." His words lingered between us, carrying a quiet, devastating clarity. Before I could respond, a soft vibration traveled through the floor, like a distant rumble, low and brief, almost imagined. Franklin's eyes widened. "There," he said, voice barely above a breath. "It brushed against you again." And for the first time, I didn't argue because deep inside something in me had felt it too. Not as fear, not as imagination, but as recognition. The vibration faded, leaving the hallway in its usual silence. But the silence no longer felt neutral. It felt watchful, as if the air itself was waiting for me to respond, to acknowledge something I didn't yet understand. My pulse thudded in my ears, and for a moment I couldn't trust my own sense of balance. It felt like the floor had shifted under me by the slightest degree. I forced myself to take a slow breath. "Franklin," I said, keeping my voice controlled, "you need to go back to your room." "I will," he said, "but not yet. I'm responsible for your safety," I insisted. "You have to—" Franklin raised a hand, stopping me. "You think this hallway is safer than where I stand?" Before I could respond, he nodded toward the far end of the corridor. "Look," he whispered. I did. At first I saw nothing, just the long stretch of pale floor tiles reflecting the overhead lights. But then something strange, subtle, something so ordinary I almost dismissed it as exhaustion. The exit sign at the end of the hall flickered. Once, twice, then steadied. "Old wiring," I muttered. "Not tonight," Franklin said. "Tonight it's following the shift." I swallowed hard. "Following what shift?" "The one you've been feeling." He stepped beside me, keeping his movements slow. "Every drift leaves traces, small signals, a slight delay in motion, a sound bending where it shouldn't, a place reacting to someone who's misaligned." The word scraped something inside of me. "I'm not misaligned," I said quietly. "Then how did you know something was wrong with the clock before it happened?" he asked softly. I froze. I hadn't told him that. Not the details. I hadn't described the second's hesitation, the way it lingered before ticking over. I hadn't mentioned how I looked away, then snapped back to it instinctively. "How did you—" "I've watched people slip," Franklin said gently. "I know the signs." He stepped back toward his room. I followed, unable to stop myself. Inside, the light from the hallway cast long shadows across his bed and the far wall. Franklin sat down carefully, hands resting on his knees. His expression changed, not to fear, not to urgency, but to resignation. "I need you to listen," he said. I remained standing. "When Luther first spoke to me about alignment," Franklin began, "I thought he was unraveling. I humored him. I entertained his ideas because I felt sorry for him. He carried so much certainty and so much sorrow." His fingers curled lightly. "But then I began noticing things, the same way you are now." He looked toward the window. The outside world was still and dark, the faint reflection of the corridor light shimmering on the glass. "I ignored the signs," he said. "I told myself it was stress, age, a failing memory, anything but what he believed." "And then?" I asked. Franklin lifted his eyes to mine. And then the moment came. He said it plainly. No drama, no tremor, no theatrics, only memory. It felt like the world exhaled. He continued. Like everything leaned in the same direction, as if the room shifted half an inch without moving. And in that shift, I realized I had stepped wrong. Not physically, temporally. The word hung in the air. "I don't want this for you," he whispered. A pressure built behind my sternum. Faint, like the early swell of panic, but colder. It spread outward, slow and steady, like ripples moving through water. Franklin noticed. "There," he said softly. "You feel it." I stepped back instinctively. "That's just stress." He shook his head. "Stress doesn't change the room." I looked around. Nothing had changed. The bed, the chair, the shadows, everything exactly where it should be. But something felt different. Something in the air between the objects. Something in the stillness. Something in me. "I'm not slipping," I whispered. "I can't be." "No one thinks they are," Franklin said, "until the moment arrives." "What happened when your moment arrived?" I asked. He closed his eyes, exhaling like he was releasing years of memory. I felt a pull, like every version of my life was tugging on me at the same time. And then, a separation, a thin tear. And I stepped through the wrong side of it. His voice grew quieter. "And once you step wrong, you don't go back." I felt my throat tighten. "You're scaring yourself," I muttered. "You're making connections that—" The hallway lights pulsed again. Just once. A soft dimming, barely perceptible. But this time, I didn't just see it. I felt it, like something brushing the edge of my awareness. Franklin opened his eyes, watching me carefully. "You're close," he whispered. closer than you want to admit, and I couldn't respond, because for the first time, I didn't know whether the shift I felt was in the building or inside me. I stepped out of Franklin's room because staying inside felt impossible. The air had taken on a density that pressed against me from all sides. Nothing supernatural, nothing dramatic, just an overwhelming sense of closeness, as if the space itself was wrapped too tightly around my ribs. I needed distance, a hallway, a breath, something that didn't feel like it was leaning toward me, but the hallway didn't feel like distance at all. It felt thinner, not shorter or narrower, thinner, like the space between one moment and the next had stretched into a fragile membrane. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, steady and even, but I no longer trusted their steadiness. The floor vibrated faintly beneath my shoes, not shaking, not moving, just vibrating, like a wire pulled taut. Franklin stepped into the doorway, watching me with a quiet sorrow that made my skin crawl. "Don't walk away," he said. "I have to," I replied, though I wasn't sure where I meant to go. "If you move too far from it, you'll feel the pull even sharper," Franklin warned. "The moment doesn't like distance. It wants proximity to decide where you belong." I forced myself to breathe deeply. I'd worked in this hospital for years. I knew every corner of it, every shift of its old heating system, every flicker of its tired wiring. And yet, I didn't feel grounded in it anymore. I felt like a guest, an intruder, someone walking through the impression of a place rather than the place itself. A soft click echoed behind me. I turned sharply. It was only the supply closet door down the hall, a door I knew I'd closed earlier, firmly, until it latched. Now it hung slightly ajar again. A thin line of cold air crept out, brushing my skin like a warning. Ordinary, explainable. Drafts, loose hinges, old buildings. But my body didn't believe it. "What do you see?" Franklin asked. "It's nothing," I said, though the words felt brittle. "The door doesn't latch sometimes." "It always latched for you before," Franklin murmured. I looked at him and he nodded, not in triumph, but in confirmation, as if witnessing me come to the same realization he once had. "Tell me what's happening," I demanded. Franklin's shoulders lowered with a long, tired breath. "You're brushing the moment. It's moving along your edges, testing where you belong, testing whether your path stayed true to the year you think is yours. That doesn't make sense. It never does at first." I felt the cold spread from the corridor, a thin ribbon of air pooling around my ankles. I stepped back instinctively. The air warmed again, almost instantly, but the warmth didn't reassure me. It felt like a reset, like a breath taken by something I couldn't see. "Why me?" I asked, voice low. Franklin stepped into the hallway, his bare feet silent on the tiles. "Because drift doesn't happen to everyone. It finds people who carry quiet doubts, people who live close to the edges of their own lives, people who make one small choice that tips them onto a path they were never meant to take." My throat tightened painfully. "What choice?" "I don't know," he said gently. "No one ever knows. The moment doesn't tell you. It just reacts to the version of you that exists now. And if I don't want it," I whispered. Franklin's expression broke with something like pity. "Moments don't care what we want. They care about alignment." The word lodged deep. I took another step back. The supply closet door creaked again, just a hair wider. The cold deepened for a heartbeat, then retreated, like a wave pulling back before another push. "Franklin," I said, feeling my voice crack, "I think I'm losing my grip." "No," he replied softly. "You're seeing your grip for the first time." A buzzing started overhead, tiny, electric, the hum of old lights struggling, but underneath it, something else. A low, barely audible murmur. Not voices, not sound. More like the faint pressure I'd felt behind my ribs earlier, now spreading outward through the corridor. Franklin looked upward, then toward me. "It's aligning," he whispered. The hum intensified, not louder, just denser, like the air itself was trembling. The shadows on the floor shifted by the smallest fraction, as if the light source had moved an inch to the left, even though it hadn't. I froze. Franklin stepped closer. "Don't move, don't run. The moment isn't choosing yet." "Choosing what?" I whispered. "Where you belong," he said. The corridor seemed to pulse once, subtle, almost imagined, like a heartbeat moving through the structure. And I realized with sickening clarity that whatever Franklin had been warning me about was no longer approaching. It was here. I stayed in the hallway long after the shift ended, long after Franklin had been escorted back to his room and the other patients had fallen into the dull quiet of medicated sleep. The building felt different in those hours before dawn, empty but expectant, like a place holding a question it never intended to answer. I kept replaying the night in my mind, not because I wanted to understand it, but because I couldn't let it go. The truth is, I tried to help him. I really did. I searched old records, combed through admission logs, even checked public databases in the hope of finding someone named Luther Kane. I wanted something solid to hold on to, a date, a birthplace, a missing persons report, anything that could anchor the story to something real. But nothing ever appeared. The name might as well have been spoken by a ghost of a memory that never belonged to this year. Franklin grew quieter over the weeks that followed. Not calmer, just tired. The kind of tired that doesn't come from sleepless nights, but from years spent carrying something no one else could see. Sometimes he would ask if the horizon looked different to me. Sometimes he would ask what year I felt I belonged to. Other times he would sit in silence and watch the floor as if listening for something beneath it. And I stayed by his side longer than I should have. I listened more than procedure allowed. I paid attention in ways that made the rest of the ward feel dimmer around the edges. But no matter what I did, no matter how closely I watched the air or the shadows or the quiet shifts in the building, I never found the moment he was waiting for. In the end, the only thing that changed was me, and I still don't know if that was what he wanted or if it was simply what the moment chose.